Hello everyone and welcome. Few teams have experienced as many behind the scenes changes as Arsenal in the last decade. We've experienced everything, even with the Gunners. We went from the end of the Wenger era, which dragged on with dead spots in the locker room, ambitions that were questioned at the actionable level because there was an internal struggle between Usmanov, the minority shareholder, and Kroenke, the majority shareholder, which concluded in 2018 with the sale of Usmanov's shares to Kroenke. The supporters were also unhappy, obviously, with the results, the absence of the title, but with the lack of investment from the owners who changed that. There was Emery, then Arteta. Especially, we moved from a traditional club, while modern in many aspects, marketing, etc., but which had a somewhat old-fashioned sporting operation which also upheld certain values. We are going to the complete opposite, meaning that at one point Arsenal literally hit rock bottom. It was agents and company. I'll give you a simple example, but Mislintat, who managed the club for 2 years on a sporting level, had extensive networks in Germany. In my opinion, he signed Stefan Liechtensteiner, who was completely burnt out. But when you see that, you say to yourself, but Tomo Kedesese, but how does the board accept it, knowing that everyone was aware that Mislintat had been working for a very long time? One of his trusted friends is Liechtensteiner's brother. So you wondered if these were sports deals or for, well, slightly different interests. And then when you're at rock bottom, when you don't win anything and now you're not even qualified for the Champions League, you are very far from it. And well, miracle to suddenly you start working well a little bit internally, setting up a coherent project again centered around Arteta, who has really gained unanimous support within the club and succeeded in convincing the management to reinvest and trust him. And now less agents, more coherence, and strangely, so I know supporters will tell me, oh yeah, yes, but we want titles. Okay, but you might potentially finish second in the Premier League for the third year in a row. A few years ago, we were very, very, very far from that. To contextualize, we will talk about the shareholder because it's very, very important. The Kroenkes, let's say, they haven't always had very, very good press. Some even compared them to the Glazers. I can understand that, except the comparison stops at the purchasing method. The Glazers completely indebted Manchester United and exploited the club massively. The Kroenkes, it was different. If there were dividends, yes, okay, but they didn't indebted the club during the buyout with a leveraged buyout like the Glazers did. Or except, in fact, they did have similarities, particularly in saying what we want is a qualification for the Champions League. Because a qualification for the Champions League guarantees you a lot of income from TV rights, more in ticket sales, and then it allows you to always have your sponsorship contracts at the maximum. So why bother investing heavily to go for a title that is uncertain? Knowing that you had City investing, sometimes it was Chelsea, Liverpool. Well, I mean, there were lots of other teams, so actually we played like United, remember? That is to say, we aimed for the Champions League. If we got a title, it was better, but it wasn't necessarily the priority. So we didn't invest heavily, and at the same time, as I was saying, there was this war in the shareholding. We remember more than 10 years ago, Usmanov had written an open letter criticizing this lack of ambition, this lack of investment. What he wanted was obviously to have some support. Popular for potentially one day becoming the majority shareholder of Arsenal, and then 6 years later, in 2018, Usmanov sells his shares, which is 30% of the club, to Kroenke, who is the sole master on board. Today, he is co-chairman of the club with his son, if I am not mistaken, and there have been many internal changes around them to better organize the club. And what is still very interesting is that in terms of marketing and all that, Arsenal is top. It's an enormous level. The Emirates contract has been reassessed and there are more and more revenues. On that front, they do the job very well. Close parenthesis, regarding ownership, the fans were grumbling, etc. And in recent years, except for the summer transfer window, but the two previous windows saw very significant investments. Knowing that these investments in the transfer market, we will talk about Declan Rice, about Gabriel Jesus. We will talk a bit about all of that afterwards. However, they were not necessarily compensated, especially before, by significant sales. Arsenal always had a problem selling its players. In fact, it's sad, but the Gunners were a club where not many players in whom a lot of money was invested buried themselves and lost their value. It is still somewhat true for some. However, Arsenal survived and continues to survive because it is a very good academy run today by the former Gunners defender Per Mertesacker. Because in recent years, we've had Smith Rowe, who left, we've had Rice Nelson, we've had Willock, we've had Eddie Nketiah. I must be pronouncing that wrong. But in fact, we've had players who are good Premier League players. So yes, people might say yes, but for Arsenal. Yes, but there's only the essence of your training, like Saka, Lewis, Kelly. Obviously, I had forgotten the name. So we're really talking about the best of the training, but the others, it still shows that the Gunners produce interesting British Premier League players. And actually, especially in terms of the financial balance sheet, it is these players who have been sold, even Iwobi a few years ago. So obviously this investment campaign, which was still quite massive, was very important and centered around Arteta. And I want to say, luckily it happened now and not before. Why? Because we're going to contextualize. The end of the Wenger era dragged on. There was a bit of sadness in the locker room. There were dead spots. The squad was poorly built. Arsenal maybe struggled a bit to transition to a certain modernity in its sporting operations, perhaps with a different structure. Except that we can criticize Wenger on many things. Today at FIFA, he would indeed deserve it. However, at Arsenal, he was the guarantor. of a certain ethic, Arsenal did not resort to some practices that other clubs used. And that, it's worth highlighting. When Wenger leaves, okay, new structure, so you have Unai Emery, who is somewhat along the same lines in terms of ethics, etc. Except he is not the coach who will really try the transfers. And you have to rethink the whole organizational chart, because Wenger, it obviously went beyond his role of coach. You will finally appoint a sporting director, Sven Mislintat, who was at Dortmund. And then you will obviously have the whole German network, the Leno, the Socrates. After that, he also recruited quite a few English players. I remember Mavropanos in particular. I don't know the Lichtsteiner, Aubameyang he had known at Dortmund. Well, you are going to recruit a lot from there. The problem being, at one point I mentioned Lichtsteiner in the introduction, I think you all understood, and it was not a success at all, especially since there were players who were overpaid. We obviously think of Nicolas Pepe the year, according to, and in fact Arsenal is going to present itself with a defense, excuse me, I have nothing against these players. But they were already the dead weights of the locker room, like the Mustafi Socrates, who is a very good guy. But it's not really, there you go, Koscielny, who had a serious injury, you had Monreal, that was fine. Then beside them you had Jenkinson, you had Lichtsteiner, you had Maitland-Niles, who were just starting out. Now we had to be serious for 2 minutes, and Kolasinac too, who came from Germany, who had qualities but also had major gaps. What were you expecting with a defense like that? What were you expecting? Knowing that up front, well, yes, you had guys, but they weren't necessarily complementary. You had Ozil, who was a bit at the end, Ramsey, who was often injured. So actually they had to start fresh. It took a long time for Arsenal. There was a year, I think it was 2007, 2008, where they started parting with a lot of guys, and it took time. That's normal. Then Arteta arrives. And then Arteta will succeed in convincing everyone with also the departure of Mislintat, and we say, okay, let's go back to basics. As I mentioned, there's Mertesacker, and then we bring back Edu, former local glory, to the sports side. And there you hit rock bottom even more, because Edu is very good friends with the playboy of Tehran, ladies and gentlemen. One of the stars of La Mano Negra, for those who read it a few years ago, Kia Jorabchian, obviously a super agent among super agents. And so, a twist of fate, we imagine, because Jorabchian was already Edu's agent during his playing career. Well, Jorabchian's clients arrived. David Luiz, Willian, did Arsenal need Willian? Explain to me. Cedric Suarez, who arrives on loan. And Arsenal will activate the purchase option. That one is magnificent. But it's not just there, because Jorabchian at one point also has a role in the coming of Ozil. So why? No idea who commissioned him. I do not know. Then obviously, you know, Arsenal actually, Everton, we don't know them. That is to say, Everton wants Iwobi. But actually, we are not capable of calling Everton. So, well, we are going to commission Kia Jorabchian. It is true that Kia Jorabchian, Everton, at the time, that was his home too. And Arsenal, it was his home. And the guy managed to get the commission. So I imagine that Gunners fans will be delighted to learn that Arsenal gave 1, possibly 2 million minimum, because he had, I think, 10% on the mandate, to Kia Jorabchian to negotiate for Arsenal between Arsenal and Everton. One wonders what the sporting director is for. So we denounced that at the time by saying at some point it's going to have to stop, because there are plenty of transfers. You can imagine that sports is not necessarily the main reason. The squad didn't look like anything. And besides that, it was during those same years when you will do a little bit before Gabriel and William Saliba. So it's still paradoxical, because on one side you have guys who served you back then for today. But anyway, let's move on. We've hit rock bottom here. It's agents and all that. Actually, it's the antithesis of what Arsenal was. And then at the British press especially talks about it, and so a discreet business is always good business. When it starts to go, karma. So there you go, Jorabchian intervened much less, and everything. Edu might have refocused as well. With Arteta, they formed a more convincing duo, and that's when the major investment policy returns, with Arteta providing a lot of input. For example, last summer, he wanted Merino. So complementary player, etc. As Sitsi Taka, in the end, you see that it is a very good pick. Arsenal is also going to get players from the Premier League, from good smaller clubs, but like Ben White, Brighton Raya, who they went to get at Brentford. So they are not guys, let's say, highly valued. Rice was. West Ham, we remember, they paid a lot. It's normal. He was an English player. It's the price, I want to say. But Rice had high expectations. The other players are complementary players. We also recruited Kivor and Tomiyasu, Polish and Japanese defenders who were already playing in Europe in good smaller clubs. I think there was one particularly in Bologna. But they're not the most highly rated guys to actually have a bit of a wider and more interesting squad. And on the other hand, obviously, we've made big efforts on Odegaard. And there, on the other hand, there's a strategy that worked less well. If we go to retrieve certain players from the big Premier League clubs who might be in a difficult situation. Gabriel Jesus, well, there's the serious injury, etc. The price might be a bit expensive. Well, I'm not necessarily going to play. Havertz, is he really meeting expectations at the moment? Well, that remains to be seen. We also have the Ukrainian left back that we got from Manchester City. I don't pronounce his name because I never managed to get it right and I don't want to butcher it. And in fact, those players have maybe lost a bit of value. It was really the best deal, but not necessarily bad deals either. Let's say in the past we had really bad deals at Arsenal, whereas now it's okay. Raheem Sterling, however, this summer, so yes, it's a loan because actually this summer, Grange said no. We've invested a lot now and we will invest less. This created some internal tensions, especially concerning Edu, but as you will see, now this policy is a bit more coherent because it actually aligns with the coach's expectations. For years, there was a sporting director working on his own and the coach maybe asking for something else. There wasn't synergy between the management, meaning the shareholders, between the sporting direction and the coaches. So it wasn't working. And now you look, so you obviously have Saka who is on top. You're going to have a clear hierarchy, obviously, with Odegaard. You had players before, but who continue to progress. We can think of Partey, we can think of Saliba and Gabriel, even if Partey, well, I haven't talked about off-field issues because otherwise I won't be very kind. We also went to get a Timber with the same idea as Tomiyasu, as Kiwar. Okay, he has Ajax. But we have, yes, he is young and all, but actually you give him time to progress. In a way, we understand the building of the squad, and because in fact all these players, all these profiles align with what Arteta wants. Even Trossard, whom you go to find at Brighton, well, go ahead, why not? Because you have a lot of experienced guys at Arsenal too, so you have both young players from your training, guys who have been there for a few years, who you got in pre-training, and a few key players. And with the host keeping somewhat like the central figure of your project, also with Saka, of course. So as we can see, it is coherent, and it is also financially coherent because you find the Champions League. Maybe there you will make second for a third consecutive year, so you find yourself with your finances. Arsenal was still losing quite a bit of money these past few years. Last year there, they had about 20 million euros in losses, a little more, which is much less because the year before it was over 60 million. So obviously the qualification for the Champions League helped a lot, the rights and everything, except that obviously the wage bill did skyrocket, but in fact it is offset by additional revenue, notably in terms of sponsorship. I had mentioned this contract renewal with Emirates, and especially we have the Champions League, the revenue it generates, and also more sales and everything. So we even understand the economy. It's getting better and better sports-wise if then you're going to tell me a title is missing. And yes, that's the problem. Will Arsenal miss out again at the finish and everything? And I understand the fans' frustration because you ask yourself, what's missing? Really? This year, honestly, you have really bad luck with such injuries. Like Havertz, Gabriel, at one point there was Saka too. For the adductors, Gabriel Jesus, well, it's said there are 6 or 7 long-term injuries almost at Arsenal, Tomiyasu, so inevitably Arteta had to patch things up and the guys aren't doing too badly in the end. Huge shout out to Merino, who will do the job at one point in attack, etc., who is also good in midfield. Frankly, he is the perfect team player who is also capable of excelling. That's exactly the type of player Arsenal was aiming for. It's very well done. We know Arsenal wants a number 9 for next year. They even tried this winter to get Watkins from Aston Villa, but the villains refused, preferring to sell John Duran. I had explained it to you, Duran was overextending. Over there in Saudi Arabia, they are happy, with John Duran, especially considering his Asian Champions League semi-final where he missed the ball. In any case, Arsenal is still ambitious, wants to score big as a number 9 this summer, so indeed they missed the title. And I understand the frustration of the fans. They have been waiting for so long and they are not going to be satisfied with the Community Shield. I understand, but today you have consistency at the highest level of the Premier League. Today you're in the semi-finals of the Champions League. So maybe you won't go through, but it's PSG facing you. Liverpool, they had a miracle in the first leg. There was no contest in the game. And Aston Villa, maybe it's Villa for the moment that has given the most trouble to PSG. We'll see if Arsenal is capable of doing it. But overall, despite all your injuries and everything, you're on the right track. So that's good. And actually, we've noticed that when you've applied a minimum of coherence, a minimum of strategy, oh well, look, miracle, it works better sports-wise. In fact, the two are intrinsically correlated. And finally, there's the future. Because as you know, Berta, the director of Atletico Madrid, is going to come as the new sporting director. I don't know the man well enough. I know he is in the media, etc. He's talked about a lot, but I don't know enough about his customs to judge. So we'll see what it's going to be like. The only thing I knew was that Arsenal had wanted him for years. And we have Edu's departure, and as a happy coincidence, Edu is going to Nottingham Forest. So I can see you from here with your very forked and quick tongue saying, but Kia Jorabchian, who has stepped back from football, it's true. The super agent, the playboy from Tehran now, he's into horse racing and so on. He's investing in horses and all. So maybe it is a happy coincidence that he got closer, especially in this regard, to the owner of Nottingham Forest, Mr. Marinakis. And it is probably by a happy coincidence that he mentioned Edu's name and that Edu is coming to manage Nottingham Forest and the MCO, the multi-club ownership of the owner of Forest. So I will skip the filth in terms of transfer a few years ago, but it still shows that there is an evolution, right? Because in recent years, Edu has worked in symbiosis somewhat with Arteta, even if he did not necessarily agree with the owner's investment policy. This summer, it ended better than it started. We literally hit rock bottom. So there you go. I hope this gives you a little more clarity, and of course, enjoy the semi-finals. Keep the faith.